Hey guys, so today we're going to be starting our second chapter, which is all about the endocrine system. Today's just going to be kind of an introduction to what the endocrine system is, some of the different organs, and what we're really talking about when we talk about like hormones and stuff like that. So this is the introduction to the endocrine system. We're going to be going over how the endocrine system helps with homeostasis, how it's related to the nervous system. We're going to talk briefly about the hypothalamus's role in kind of coordinating all of the endocrine system responses. We're going to briefly also talk about the difference between endocrine and exocrine gland, as well as between positive and negative feedback loops. Then we're going to go over different types of hormones and how they affect the body. And lastly, we'll just touch on what all of the different glands of the endocrine system are. So both the endocrine system and the nervous system help regulate the body's internal environment and maintain homeostasis, which just means like keep the internal environment stable. Homeostasis is a type of dynamic equilibrium because the internal conditions are constantly fluctuating and the body must respond in ways and make these little changes and adaptations in order to keep the internal conditions within an acceptable range. So for example, the human body works best at 37 degrees Celsius, a 0.1% blood glucose level, and a blood pH of 7.35. So both the endocrine system and the nervous system are constantly making these little changes in the body to try and maintain these levels. Both the nervous and endocrine system are made up of receptors, a coordinating center, and an effector. So a receptor is something that gets the signal that there's a change happening. The coordinating center is the one that kind of then tells the effector what to do, and the effector is the thing that actually makes the change happen. So receptors in the endocrine system are constantly monitoring the body's internal environment to see if any changes are happening. If the internal environment leaves that kind of normal or ideal range, the receptors are going to send a signal to the coordinating center, which will then send a signal to the effector to make a change happen. And in the case of the endocrine system, the effectors are going to be different glands in the body. The receptors and the coordinating center are also part of the nervous system. So for the most part, the coordinating center is the hypothalamus in the brain, and the receptors are the same receptors, like the same sensory receptors that are inside of your body. So yeah, the endocrine receptors are just sensory receptors. When they're going to be stimulated, they send an impulse off to the brain. And like I said, for the endocrine system, the part of the brain that's going to coordinate everything is the hypothalamus. So for example, the hypothalamus sets your ideal temperature set point, which in normal conditions would be 37 degrees, would be closer to 40 degrees Celsius. If you had an infection and your brain decided a fever would be the best way to fight it. But everything from blood pressure to blood glucose to pH to osmotic pressure is all monitored and controlled by the endocrine system. And again, the effectors are just the endocrine glands. The hypothalamus is the region of the brain responsible for homeostasis. It coordinates the endocrine system to help the body maintain that steady state. So it's going to constantly be receiving signals from the internal sensory receptors. And then if an adjustment is needed, it will send out a signal through the autonomic nervous system or to specific glands using hormones through the blood. So some parts of the endocrine system are controlled by like nervous system signals sent from the hypothalamus through your neurons to a gland, and other times the hypothalamus will send a hormonal signal through the blood to a gland. But regardless, it's going from the hypothalamus to a gland. And yeah, then those different glands can release their own hormones or different chemicals in order to change body temperature, blood pressure, metabolism, etc. A lot of these hormones are controlled by negative feedback loops. So a negative feedback loop is anything that brings a system back to normal. So it kind of like cuts itself off and stops the changes from just kind of snowballing. So a ton of these hormones, if you have too much of the hormone or too much of a product of a gland building up in the blood, you'll have a negative feedback loop that's going to cut off the release of that hormone or the release of that substance from a gland. So that is a negative feedback loop. So whatever is happening as that product or whatever builds up, it'll cut off the production of that product. Positive feedback loops are much more rare. That is when a change is amplified over time. Essentially, you get further and further away from the original condition. And this happens when you need some sort of change in your body to happen really quickly, and then the feedback loop is stopped eventually. And I don't think, yeah, in the next unit, there is actually a hormone that goes through a positive feedback loop, but I don't think we're going to talk about it in the endocrine system. That'll be for the next unit. Okay, a gland is just a specialized group of cells that secrete a substance, and there are both exocrine and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands are like your sweat glands. They secrete their substance through a duct, either into a cavity in the body or onto the surface of the body. So like sweat glands secrete sweat onto the surface of your body. Salivary glands secrete saliva into the cavity of your mouth. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, make and secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream, where they then get carried through the blood to whatever part of the body they're targeting. The endocrine system is, as the name suggests, made up of endocrine glands that make and secrete hormones. An endocrine hormone is just a chemical that is secreted by an endocrine gland, and again, endocrine glands always release their hormones directly into the bloodstream. That hormone will then go and stimulate a target cell or a target organ to perform a specific task. The endocrine system produces much slower, but also more general and longer lasting responses than the nervous system. So the nervous system relies on electrical signals. They travel very quickly, but they go to a very specific place and they are like over very quickly. They get there quickly, they're also over quickly. The endocrine system uses chemical signals instead of electrical ones, those chemical signals being hormones. And because those hormones are going to be circulating through the blood, it takes them longer to get where they're going because they have to go usually like through your veins and then to your heart and then pumped out of your heart to your arteries and then your capillaries. So it's a longer pathway usually, so it takes longer. But it also lasts longer because the hormones are kind of like slowly getting to the target area, like some faster than others because they're all spread out in the bloodstream. And also, it can go to multiple places at once because obviously your blood gets carried all over your body. Hormones are just chemical regulators that are made in cells of a specific gland and then go and target different cells of a different gland. So all of these hormones can go and either speed up or slow down different bodily processes. They're going to trigger their target cell to do something by binding to a receptor on that target cell. And since receptors and hormones need to match, only like certain hormones will target like only certain cells or glands and stuff like that. Hormones can influence everything from metabolism, growth, homeostasis, etc. And there are also more like broad hormones that don't just target one specific type of cell or one specific type of organ. There are a few hormones that target a bunch of different types of cells. Most hormones are water soluble, which means they dissolve in water, and they're made up of amino acids. They're going to bind to receptor sites on the cell membrane of the target cells. That is then going to activate an enzyme which is in the cytoplasm of the cell to carry out a function. Water-soluble hormones can't actually diffuse across the cell membrane because the inside of the cell membrane has no water in it. Then you have the fat-soluble hormones, which are also called steroids. They're usually made in either the adrenal cortex or the gonads, which are the testes and ovaries. Those hormones can diffuse through the cell membrane and actually bind to a receptor within the cytoplasm of the cell. Some chemicals work as both neurotransmitters and as hormones, so they work as part of the endocrine system and as part of like synapse transmission in the nervous system. Hormones can work together to trigger changes, so sometimes you'll have like a whole series of hormones that are doing something. Hormone production is, like I said, often regulated by a negative feedback loop. So once the hormone has essentially done its job, that enzyme production will be inhibited. Some proteins will continue to move through the bloodstream and can actually be taken out of the blood by the liver and kidney as well. And these are all of the different endocrine glands that you need to know. Endocrine glands are ductless. They don't have ducts because they just secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream, as opposed to our exocrine glands that secrete them into ducts and then into like a cavity or something. So you need to know the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which are both in the brain, the thyroid and parathyroid, which are in your throat, the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, the pancreas, which is tucked underneath your stomach, and then also the ovaries and testes, or the gonads. And tomorrow we'll get into all of this in more depth.